done. Please welcome Mr. Eric McCamey.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. We appreciate you being here and look forward to sharing some insights that can help you maximize the cash engine for your business. So the things that we're going to talk about are we're going to look at the importance of cash, understanding why cash is important, and understand it from a little bit different view. Look at the process overview of how is it that in a company that operates with projects, mostly government contractors are what we're talking about, what's the process for generating cash and how does that work? And then we're going to look at what some of those failure points are along that process and what are some of the root causes that go behind it. Finally, we're going to look at the DSO metric, days sales outstanding, and look at how we can parse that metric to maybe tell us a little bit more about how our operations are moving. And then finally, we're going to talk about the visibility key, because a lot of what we say during this webinar might be some things that you heard before, but until you can get that visibility that we're talking about, then it's going to be tough for you to know whether you're actually implementing some of the things that we're talking about. So let's get right into it. Just real quick, that's the marketing blurb. This is about as far as it goes with it. Is the Business Insight and Transformation Group is our company, and what we try to do is to consult giving you the root cause of some of the problems. So we try not to fix symptoms, but our particular modus operandi is really getting to the root cause of things, and then using that, we try to help implement transformation solutions that will change your business fundamentally as to how it operates and how it works. We deal with ERP solutions, business intelligence, process improvements, and all these types of things, primarily focused in the areas of finance and project management and controls. Okay? All right, so why is cash important? Everyone's heard the expression before, cash is king. Well, why is cash king? There's a principle which some of us may have heard of before, but the time value of money. So the basic thing is that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Why? Because inflation is going to eat it up. If I do nothing, inflation is going to eat it up. I can stick it under my mattress, and the dollar that I have today won't be worth the same thing as it will be worth as it is worth today. So it's going to experience inflation. It's going to eat away my money. And then every dollar that's in my pocket today, I can make it work for me. So I can put it in a bank and I can get interest on it, or I can invest it in a piece of machinery. I can invest it in some computers, equipment. I can hire a new BD guy. I can do all those things that can add value to my company. But if I don't have the cash to do those things, then I'm going to have a problem, and I can't live with the basic operations of my company. So you could get a $5 million contract and you say, hey, that's great. But if I can't turn that into cash in a timely manner, then maybe I can't even keep the lights on, or I can't pay my people. So being able to manage cash flow is very, very important. How fast your company turns revenues into cash is paramount. So whoever really can win at that game wins. And that really translates into higher profits effectively for the entire organization. Revenues that you may recognize and the sales that you make that never turn into cash are really pretty much meaningless. So we're going to try to help you to get cash in the door faster. So think about your company as a cash engine. So it has some inputs, it does some things, and then then there's an output that you want to have happen, or maybe think about it as a factory. So you're going to execute the work. That's obviously delivering whatever the service or product there is to the customer. And then you're going to charge your expenses to charge numbers or project structures, whatever the term is in your accounting system, and you're going to charge non-labor costs, all those things. And then when you do that, there are going to be hopefully some cost controls and things in place. So you make sure people charge the right number, they charge the right labor category if it matters, that costs are incurred against the purchase order, against the right line item numbers, all those types of things. And then that's going to happen throughout the month, hopefully. And then you're going to bill those costs if you have a cost-sensitive type contract. If it's a fixed price contract, it's a little bit of a different model. Then you're going to collect that cash, and then hopefully you can have that cash to help you with paying out dividends or shareholder distributions. You've got to pay your creditors, investors, covering funding gaps. If you're in the government contracting industry, that's a huge issue and a huge thing. The government isn't always timely in generating modifications to contracts, and when you spend over the funding limit, you're taking a risk. Well, you have to have cash in order to be able to cover that, because effectively you're kind of giving the government a short-term loan. You need cash in order for investments and to purchase capital assets, and then also to pay your salaries of your people, to pay your vendors, all those things. So how well this engine works determines how well you can do those other things that cause your company to work and to be able to go back and execute more work. So getting this cash engine optimized is essential. Okay, so let's look a little bit about the process again and talk about it. The process for generating cash begins long before you're ready to start generating an invoice. So the first piece is to negotiate billing terms and payment terms. So every contract has a section that talks about the payment terms, the billing terms. So you want to look at those things. Am I getting net 30? Am I getting net 45? Could I talk them into something even smaller? So that's a big part of it. How am I going to generate invoices and bill, because those things have the potential to slow down your cash engine as well. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. How you set up your project in the accounting system is very, very important. It's kind of a garbage in, garbage out type of a mindset. If you structure it well and you invest in that up front, you can have effective cost controls and effective billing downstream. How you set up your purchase orders and your vendors in the accounting system is important. And then of course, those things will set you up in order to be able to charge your labor, pay your invoices, do all those things. The next step in the process for those who are a little bit more accounting minded is to recognize revenue. I won't get into the debits and credits, but it's there for your information if you wanted to see it. So you recognize revenue, and then you get to the end of your month, and now it's time to start generating invoices. But as you start to do that, it's important to manage the invoice cycle and the approval process. So think about it from the time that you generate an invoice to the time that it actually goes to a customer. It's important to really be able to monitor what's happening in that process. And so that's going to be a key thing that we want to wrap up with the end of this presentation. Okay, so we generate those invoices and we have to send those invoices. And then there's a process if you have a collections department or if you have your accounts receivable staff doing that, then you want to facilitate collection. So I like to say facilitate because a lot of that can be built on relationships and not necessarily badgering your customer to, on day 29 to say, hey, your invoice is due tomorrow. And then finally, you have to receive and post the cash. So the major takeaway from this is that the process of effective cash flow begins long before you start to generate invoices, and it really starts from the time that you negotiate the contract. Also, there are elements to monitor and optimize at each step. So as you stop and think about each one of these steps, what could I do more effectively? What could I do to take out any delays in the system? Just a real quick thing, I won't go into this a lot, is just be aware that as we talk about some of these things, they're what I like to call cost-sensitive contracts and non-cost sensitive. So the cost-sensitive ones are cost plus, T&M, things where you actually have to charge to a right bucket and you're billing actual cost to a customer or you're billing hours at a billing rate. And non-cost sensitive are fixed price contracts, software licenses, resales, things like that where you're selling a product maybe, or you just have agreed to a fixed amount for the service that's going to be done, or the product that you're developing or delivering, or things like that. Okay. Here's a statement that I hope that will stick with you as much as anything in this presentation, is that most cash flow problems did not originate in your billing or accounts receivable shop. I'll say that again. Most cash flow problems did not originate in the billing or accounts receivable shop. And I say that because sometimes organizations can act as though those things did start there, and they'll beat up on that staff, and people believe that the problem is with that billing department, and really the problem started long before that. Again, a lot of it has to do with what you set up before the contract was ever signed, what kind of terms did you agree to, but also what kind of invoices did you agree to put out there on the street. Did you agree to something that's really, really hard to produce later on? It's important to know those things. How you set up your project accounting systems, which we talked about, and then how you're monitoring and controlling the cost and the hours that have to be billed to the customer. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the factors that influence cash flow over the project life cycle. I won't talk about each one of these things, but it's here for you to take a quick look at, and I'll talk about some of them. Looking at the negotiation stage, There's payment terms, which we talked about. Does the customer have to pay me in 30 days, 45 days? I've even heard of as bad as 60 days, which is not something that you want to agree to. How often can I bill this customer? Can I bill them every 2 weeks instead of every 30 days? That sounds excessive to some people, but it is negotiable, and there are ways to get to that. Standard invoicing formats. What kind of a format do I have to invoice? And we can talk a little bit about lagging cost and how the customer looks at those, because sometimes they want to hold up an invoice because they want all the costs that pertain to a month. They want that in the current month. And there's some ways to educate the customer and to get out of some of those things. Again, I won't reach through each one. During the initiation stage, how do I set up my accounting system, which we've talked about a couple of times? Work authorization. Am I authorizing people and giving them the correct project numbers and making sure that I have the right project numbers established in my purchase order when that gets set up? Have I planned for my cash flow? Looking at large material purchases. If you have to buy a piece of equipment that costs $800,000, are you buying it in a just-in-time fashion so that you aren't expending cash before you have to? And then as you do so, are you planning your milestone payments from your customer such that you will have the cash from the customer in time so that you don't have to actually use your company's cash and go into a deficit in order to finance that? Then finally, in the execution stage, we look at how we code and how we pay invoices to our subcontractors. What's our invoicing strategy? Is there an invoicing strategy? Do I get my big bills out first? Do I get my fixed price projects done first? So there's a strategy in order to be able to get as much money billed first so you can actually collect the big dollars first and then move to the smaller things. Manual invoicing, that's something we want to try to avoid, or any type of a thing that causes you to have to touch that invoice along the way. Looking at your cost along the way. Within the month, not waiting until the end of the month in order to be able to look at those costs. Sometimes people look at the invoice as a cost report in itself, and that's really a little bit too late. But the number one thing, and I'll skip down a little bit, is the visibility factor. So how can I see what's happening in that invoice generation process? And that's the thing that was going to be key for us in order to make the process. And then when I was with General Dynamics, it was a $1.8 billion division that I was able to achieve a reduction between 15 and 20 days consistently. And the number one factor that influenced that was a system process that we put in place in order to be able to track what's happening with invoices and give it visibility within the organization. Okay? So talking about what happens before you sign the contract, we talked about that a little bit. And here's the thing that I would like for you to walk away with, is that regardless of the impression that your customer may be giving you, and that includes the federal government, everything is negotiable. They want things and you want things. The main thing that they want is within the federal government specifically, and really within any organization, is they want to look good to their superiors. They don't want to have any problems, and they want to stay compliant with all of the regulations and things that they have in place. And so when you're negotiating, you may find that what the customer believes is a must-have might be satisfied a different way. In one particular case that I was working with the FAA, they were insistent that they had all costs that belong to January, for example, that they wanted all of that in there before we send an invoice. So that would mean you might have to wait a whole nother 30 days for your subcontractors to put their costs in and you to schedule them in your AP system and all that kind of stuff. And it really impacted our cash flow. But I was able to negotiate with them and say, hey, how about if I give you the January invoice in 2 pieces? So here's my main cost. So I'm invoicing you 90% of the dollars, all of my labor and all of that stuff. But then I'm going to have a follow-up invoice, so call it January B, where I pick up all of those trailing costs. And that worked for them because the main thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to put it in a bucket called January, because that was something that they had to do, and folks didn't want to violate any of their internal processes. So, so could you also, another thing to think about is, could you trade a little profit in order to be able to bill more frequently? That is a huge influencer of cash flow, if you can bill more frequently and not have to carry that cash that it takes to pay your people, to pay vendors, to keep the lights on, to do all those things, if you could actually trade a little profit in order to get the cash flow, that will work. Now, you need to do the math to make sure that works out for you, but there are things you can do. Also, you can offer discounts to customers if they pay early. So if you pay in 15 days, then we'll give you X% off of your invoice. Again, do the math to make sure it works for you, but it's something that you could offer and something that you could do. Finally, within thinking about things that you do before you sign the contract, I would say avoid like the plague anything unique that requires your team to do something differently than what is natural to the system or what is good processes. So anytime you have to stop the assembly line, if you would, that's going to be a problem. Invoices manually generated in Excel. If you're a small company, you might be doing that, but really try to move to a system where you have something automated where the system generates an invoice and you don't have to add a lot of variation to those things. In the long run, when you agree to do a lot of different things for a customer on their invoice or give additional backup that's outside of what the system normally does, you're adding time and you're hurting your cash flow. And really, ultimately, it hurts both you and the customer because those types of things tend to lead to errors in things that are not consistent with the way you set things up in the system. Okay? I mentioned the assembly line before, and I thought this was kind of a cute picture. I used it on one of my emails that I sent out. And it's this, that Henry Ford did not so much invent the automobile, but he perfected the modern assembly line in mass production. So other people had actually come up with cars before Henry Ford did. I believe it was Carl Benz was his name, the guy where we get the Mercedes-Benz name from, actually came up with a vehicle most close to what we recognize today before he did, and there were some long before that. But he really didn't really invent the car, but he invented that assembly line process, and it was said that Henry Ford said that people could have any car, their car painted any color that they wanted as long as it was black. Why did he say that? Because he understood the importance of staying within a regular process and not changing things up. So that is something that's going to help you as much as possible. Now, if you've got a $800 million contract, then maybe you'll invent a standard billing format or standard reports that can be executed out of the system specifically for that contract, but you have to avoid getting into that for every piece of revenue that you have coming in the door. Okay, so the project setup considerations that we talk about. Your company has most likely invested in an ERP system or accounting system, to just use a simple term, with some level of capabilities. It can do some different things, especially if it's meant for project-based businesses. So how you structure and how you use these features can make the difference and help deal with the root cause of a whole lot of problems that show up when the invoice is generated. So, for example, does your project structure support, and I will say it in this order, billing first, revenue recognition second, and project reporting third? Why billing first? Because if you can't get an invoice out the door, then it's no need even being in business. And so while sometimes a project manager may disagree with that, say, hey, I need to report to my customer, no, the first priority is to be able to bill, for example, consistent with the cleanse structure as necessary. There are other ways to get the project manager what he needs. There's alternate project structures if you use cost point, for example. There's different ways you can map numbers in order to get to the work breakdown structure, all those types of things. Revenue recognition is second. Again, a customer doesn't see that. It's internal, but of course, shareholders, investors, your financial statements are very, very important. And then project reporting third. All three are important, but I think it's important to organize your project structure with that priority in mind. If your system supports labor category setups, do you have that set up properly? Do you have the correct billing rate associated with each labor category? So that way, when people charge into the system, then they know that that the hours are going to land in the right bucket. And that has to do with how you set things up initially. We'll also look at the ceilings that you put in place to suppress certain types of costs. For example, you could find out that local travel is not billable, and somebody corrects that on the invoice every month. Well, you're slowing down the assembly line when you do that. There's ways to put ceilings on those costs in advance so they don't show up on your invoice and a person doesn't have to slow down and do that. Okay? Real quick, I won't go into a whole lot of detail, But sometimes customers and contractors alike can confuse the purpose of an invoice. They use their invoices as a report. So they want to see all of their costs, like I mentioned earlier in the example. So they're using that invoice to see how much they're spending. But some education might help that customer to understand that, hey, let me give you a status report that shows you costs all the way up through the reporting date, which might include accrued expenses and things that I haven't yet paid for, but yet we really have spent those things. But the invoice is what's really billable right now. So if you can divorce that in their mind, then that will also help your cash flow, and they won't force you to hold up the big dollars for the little dollars. Contractors can do the same thing. As I mentioned, you don't look at your costs all month, but then you look at your cost in the invoice and say, hey, Fred shouldn't have charged this project, or so-and-so charging to the wrong labor category. Well, those things hopefully should have been discovered earlier in the month and dealt with before it comes time to bill. So the only thing that is, in quotes, kind of forgivable is if the mistake was made during the very last week of the accounting period, and it has to be corrected the next week. So those are the things that we want to look at as well. Okay. Finally, I said I was going to talk a little bit about days sales outstanding. DSO, or days sales outstanding, is a metric that is used in many, many companies, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit to say that DSO is equal to the billed accounts receivable and the unbilled accounts receivable divided by the average revenue per day. Now, some companies also throw in inventory or work in process or some other balance sheet accounts like that. But essentially, this is used to determine how fast your company is turning revenues into cash. So if, for example, you have a DSO of 45 days, that's saying from the time that I recognize revenue to the time that I actually get cash in the door, it's taking me about 45 days. And this can be calculated using any snapshot of time that you want. The billed and unbilled AR balances are balances, so it's as of a certain point in time, and at a certain snapshot, and it's just a balance of what that is. And then the period of time that you use to calculate the average revenue per day, that could be a year, could be a quarter, or what I've seen most frequently is a 3-month kind of a rolling quarter thing. So basically, you take that 3 months worth of revenue and divide it by 90 days. Now, I want to show you a different way to maybe look at your DSO metric that you might not have thought about. Remember when you were taking algebra in high school? Remember they said A plus B divided by C is equal to A over C plus B over C, right? We all remember that, hopefully. If not, don't say anything. You're on mute anyway, so you can't. Okay, I can't hear you laugh with that either. So anyway, think about it this way. Have you ever considered looking at your DSO the same way? So you have the unbilled AR plus the billed AR divided by the average revenue per day, but you could break that up and look at the unbilled AR divided by the average revenue per day plus the billed AR divided by the average revenue per day. So that will give you an understanding of how much each element is contributing to your DSO. So it's mathematics. It has to work out. So if you look at this example, I won't go into the depth of it, but I run that calculation on an example. So in this particular case, you have a DSO of 68 days, which a lot of companies are reporting they're that high. And so if you broke that up, you would say, hey, I have a target of, let's say, 20 days. And I think that's a bit high, but let's say 20 days to get invoices out the door, and then 30 days, let's say all of my contracts in the perfect world had net 30. That's not reality, but I'm using that for the example. So you would find that your DSO for your unbilled was 36 days, and then you're 16 days over target, and then your DSO for the billed AR is 32 days, and you're 2 days over target. So that's a different way to look at it that maybe you haven't done before, but something to consider and think about. And you can run this for the organization level, or you can run it on your individual project. Okay? Now here's the point where we're kind of culminating and getting all of this stuff to the one point. And here's the key. Without visibility into the entire cash generation process, most of what we have said so far are just good ideas that may or may not be implemented. So you've got to be able to tell. You have to be able to know whether someone is correcting the exact same error every month. You have to have a way of seeing that. And unless you're tracking it, there's no way to tell. And unless you're tracking it and making it visible, there's no way to really influence that behavior. So what we believe is necessary is to have an invoice cycle management system. So you need that. You need a system that's going to allow invoices to be internally approved before being sent. So if you do that, most companies have some kind of a review process, but you don't want to be emailing those things around. You want to have a system, a web-based system that's going to allow you to do that. You want something with some level of workflow notification as to the approval status. So you want to know the invoice has been generated and posted. Okay, now it's in Fred's hands. Fred has now approved the invoice, and now it goes to Sally. And okay, now the billing person can say, okay, if I have all the approvals, now we can send it out the door. And it needs to be able to track the dates as to when processes were generated, when the invoices were generated, and when they were sent, and each stage in the review process. So that way, if Fred has been sitting on it too long, I have to be able to know that. You want the system to be able to allow for daily reporting to executive level influencers during billing weeks, because that's really the way that you get the movement point. Nobody wants to be on that report that shows that a $3 million invoice has been sitting in their hands for 3 days and they haven't done anything with it. Putting those things out on a daily basis during the weeks that you're trying to bill is of infinite value. The system also should facilitate learning each time that an invoice has to be reworked. So you don't want people just to reject invoices internally and then they go and fix the invoice again. You want to know why that happens, so that way you can have learning, so you can see here's how many dollars were rejected internally because we had labor charging issues or we had costs that hit the wrong bucket for some other reason. We want to be able to know that so we can influence that and change. Okay. Some of the benefits of a system like that would include the ability to monitor the time it takes to review and send invoices. We talked about that. The ability to track the number of times invoices have to be corrected and why. So not just the the dollar value and the reasons, but how many times did this happen? You also want to have a central repository of all your invoices and the approval history that went along with those. You want to be able to sort and manage items based on the status or stage of the game. And you want to be able to use a web form to capture all the data needed by the billing staff. So what's the project number? What's the organization? Anything else that's important and necessary. You also want to have the work notifications, all those things we talked about, and you want to be able to sort by the responsible project manager, all those things. And you also want to know if your billing strategy is being followed. Are the big dollars truly being influenced first? Okay, so what BITG can do and what we're offering, and again, there's no one-time offer, that kind of a thing that we're talking about right now, but we do have a SharePoint-based solution that really doesn't cost you anything else in terms of investing in a new workflow system or anything like that. It's built directly on SharePoint, and it's using capabilities that are already there. Now, it is what I would call kind of a crude or poor man's workflow, but this actually worked when I was with General Dynamics for a division of that company that did $1.8 billion in revenues, and this thing dropped from the high 60s down to sometimes in the high 40s and in the low 50s, and still maintaining that as far as I know. So this is this system works. It's and it can be implemented in a very short period of time. It can be done in less than a week. It's really setting it up in a day or so, and then teaching you to use the reports and all those things is something that takes a little bit of time within that. The other thing that we can do is that we can work with you to work with your workflow tool or a tool that we have through a partner that can bring a workflow tool that you can use for other things, but we can also define this process for you. That'll take a little bit more money, time, and all those things, but we can do that for you. So that's really what we're offering and what we're talking about here. And so right now we're opening it up to questions. I don't know if there are any questions out there, but we'll open it up to questions. I don't see any in the box right now. I'll give a few minutes for questions to type those things in if you would like to do so. All right, I don't see questions, so I won't keep us on the line longer. Let me just give you some follow-up steps here. All right.
Okay, so we would like to thank you guys for attending. Is there any more information that you'd like to give them before they leave, Eric?
No, I don't think so. Just the information on this slide here, I think will be sufficient for us to be able to follow up.
Okay. So we hope you gain some valuable information from attending this webinar. And if you don't have any other questions or you'd like to have any questions in the future, you can contact Eric through info@bitgconsulting.com. And we thank you again for attending. We hope you can gain some benefit through our services now and in the future. Would you say that you're done, Eric, or we're good?